One of the areas that many developers overlook when working with SharePoint is SharePoint Designer and the workflow capabilities. This is a bit of a shame because, workflow in SharePoint is very highly developed and has a lot of ability to create functionality in SharePoint that otherwise would take quite a good bit of code. This is, in my opinion, maybe why so often those of us who regularly do development like to pull out Visual Studio or work with actually compiled code rather than workflows is because we're used to it. On the other hand, working with SharePoint implementations, I've actually gone through and taken whole swaths, literally hundreds of applications that were written inside to fit inside of SharePoint and replaced them with workflows and several lists and put them together and created both a much easier to maintain system, a much more accessible system, and a much more agile system. So what we're going to do here is look through the whys, the why nots, and the hows of using SharePoint Designer and SharePoint workflows to create capabilities for your customers. The pieces in this section are going to be why to use SharePoint Designer? What are the pieces what are the good points? What are the bad points? Where, again, like the other sections that we're talking about, where's the appropriate time to pull out this tool from your toolbox? Second will be how to set up the environment. When you go through the other sections, you'll see when we talk about Napa, there's some moving parts going on with different accounts and registrations and URLs and things like that. When we're talking about Visual Studio, there's a lot of installing Visual Studio and making sure it's configured, and making sure you've got all the right templates, and making sure you've got the right dev environment that you've got the Visual Studio installed on, and all of those kind of things. With SharePoint Designer, we're going to talk about the things you need to look at for using SharePoint Designer and SharePoint. Should be a lot easier than the others with a couple of caveats, so it'll be kind of interesting walking through that. Then we'll actually look at creating a workflow, the things you need to be thinking about when you create this workflow, because it is fairly different than tactically how you would actually create, say, a SharePoint solution or a web part or something like that. But a lot of the same processes are in place, and specifically I use that word process because that's what we're going to be looking at, is how we can actually get to the process without needing a lot of additional capabilities with letting SharePoint actually handle a lot of those pieces. We'll also talk just a little bit about how workflow has changed in SharePoint 2013 and some of the things you need to be aware of there. After that, we'll look at validating a workflow, basically making sure that what you put together on that workflow works, that you're not going to get a lot of exceptions, and that it's going to be appropriate for your users, that what you're creating is actually going to be what your users need and what your server can actually use for scaling. Then we'll look at uploading the workflow, actually how to get it into your SharePoint instance, and actually get it in the right spot, because one of the interesting things with workflows is there are things such as a class and an object. You can actually have the workflow templates, and you can have the workflow associations, and we'll look at how those tie in and put those in place. So let's start off with why use SharePoint Designer. Most developers kind of look at it and say, yeah, SharePoint Designer, as the name suggests, is for designers. It's to allow non-developers to work with SharePoint capabilities, whether those capabilities are creating a new list and all the custom columns that you're going to get in there, maybe do some associations between lists for the designers to go in and put themes in place, to put custom style sheets, maybe work with the HTML. All of these kind of things are what you normally look at when you're thinking about SharePoint Designer. But with SharePoint 2013, you get a lot of new capabilities around workflow. And SharePoint Designer is one of your better tools for going in there and working with it. In previous versions of SharePoint, workflows were generally single instance or specific use. Through using SharePoint Designer, if you wanted to actually do workflows that were for your entire organization or scalable workflows, you had to go into Visual Studio. A lot of that's kind of been looked at this time with SharePoint Designer and SharePoint 2013. So you get a lot more capabilities. There's a lot more reason to go into SharePoint Designer to create those workflows for your implementation. And SharePoint 2013 works with Office 13 to make it easy to create and build those no-code workflows. I say that because for Office 2013, because there's a lot of things that tie in. Your end users are generally often going to be using SharePoint through the web interface, but more and more you're seeing SharePoint being used in, say, Word or Excel or all the rest of it. And then there are tools inside of Office as well, like Visio, that can really allow you as a SharePoint architect or SharePoint developer to bring in those users that you're trying to make happy, let them be able to see what they're doing, maybe even have them give you direct flowcharts of what they're trying to put into the implementation to put everything together to really make it work. It's one of those pieces where instead of kind of going in with the user, writing down something in your notes, going back, implementing it, and coming back in and letting them see yes, no kind of thing, and doing those kind of cycles. I've actually had the experience of going into rooms with business owners or with process owners, working through the workflow with SharePoint Designer in the room with them, put it up on a projector, walk through it, and actually have projects move significantly forward during the meeting. Let them go away and actually try it for a week, and then come back and the next week maybe close out a project that might have taken a month of meetings and QA and all the rest of it if you go through a more traditional route. So there's a lot here that as a SharePoint developer you need to look at. Don't let the fact that some of this isn't code, you're not using a compiler, know that you are doing business process automation, and that's really what your users are interested in. And then the SharePoint Designer, another nice piece about it is it works equally well with on-premises, with hosted, and with cloud SharePoint. Because it does work as a client software connecting to whichever one of those SharePoint instances that you're looking at, you're actually very easy to connect with wherever. So it's a really great Swiss Army knife for pulling it out and working with your various implementations. Whereas with Visual Studio, if you're working with on server-side tools, you have to be on the SharePoint server or have some very, very tight integration with remote debugging, which is been challenging to work with all through the process, or with Napa, where that you're kind of have to have the Napa tool on your implementation, which is generally right now the SharePoint or the SharePoint dev site, which is on office.com and some of those pieces. So just be aware of SharePoint Designer allows you a lot more flexibility in the various implementations. Many places only have one SharePoint implementation, but large organizations have many, many different types. And if you're doing something such as creating applications or creating these workflows to push out into a market, if you're a independent software vendor that's taking advantage of SharePoint, being able to work with different types of SharePoint implementations is also a big, big plus. So setting up the environment. It's SharePoint Designer. What do you do? What else do you need to do? SharePoint Designer 2013 can be installed on Windows 7 and up, 32-bit or 64-bit. At this point, I still haven't seen anybody say really why the 64-bit you need to go with that. Most of the things I've seen still recommends Office applications stick with 32-bit, but know that you can go either way. I'm sure at some point we're going to be looking at needing to be 64-bit for some of the Office, but right now stick with the 32-bit if you don't have a good reason for it to do otherwise. SharePoint Designer can be attached to SharePoint 2013 server environment that the user has permissions for. So make sure that the current user has permissions in for the appropriate locations in SharePoint. But because it is going through the documented SharePoint interfaces, as long as you can get to pretty much port 80 with whatever SharePoint environment you're looking at, you're good to go. It could be on the same box. It could be halfway around the world, as long as that user has the appropriate permissions. Note that you do need to make sure that SharePoint 2013 does allow SharePoint Designer. Make sure that you're going in there and that your admins have not disabled that. That is something that if you go through the administrative course, we look at where you can enable and disable SharePoint Designer. Some locations are a little bit nervous about using SharePoint Designer with their implementation. This is because in previous generations, SharePoint Designer had less controls and less management tools in it, and you could really mess up a SharePoint implementation using SharePoint Designer. With the current ways of doing SharePoint, with the current infrastructure, being able to roll sites back to template, being able to actually manage different capabilities in SharePoint that can be managed by SharePoint Designer. That's not such much of a big deal, but with governance, with being able to tie in the SharePoint Designer to the SharePoint implementation, know that if you're running into a problem, it may be that your SharePoint server administrators have locked that down, and check with them to make sure that everything's set up and open. And SharePoint Designer works best with the full Office 2013 plus Visio. There are some things SharePoint Designer does work on its own. You can actually go through and do quite a number of things with SharePoint Designer, but note that you can actually tie in, and with the big push for not just being able to develop with SharePoint Designer, but actually tie in with some of the different tools in Office, having the full Office 2013 Pro and then adding Visio on that can make a big difference. Visio is there for being able to do flow charting, to be able to do very visual representation of how those workflows go. In this section, we're not going to go deeply into Visio, but know that if you're working with non-developers or people who are more business process people, having Visio can really make a difference. So now we kind of looked at what you need to do to install. Let's look at creating a workflow, what you need to consider when you're doing that. SharePoint 2013 supports list workflows, site workflows, and reusable workflows. This reusable workflow sounds kind of interesting, but it's one of those that it's the piece that before used to be a enterprise workflow in SharePoint 2010 and previous. And what you can actually do with that is tie it in with pretty much anything around the system. You can actually attach it to things like content types or site columns or all kinds of information that you may need that you may want workflow on. Say you want to, when someone creates a new piece of information or a new content type in your enterprise, you want it to be gone through a proper approval process, maybe a documentation process, maybe even go through your legal team to make sure that they've got the proper holds and everything in place. That's what a reusable workflow is, to be able to attach those pieces of information, put it in place, and be able to move it forward as your system goes. List workflows are for those specific lists. List workflows are very, very valuable. They tend to be very tactical, though. You actually go in and anything in your organization that may have a queuing system or a ticketing system, look at list workflows absolutely right off the bat. Your mind should immediately jump to something like that because it's very, very easy to put those that list workflow on an issue list or maybe a task list and turn that into a system where users can come in and enter in their tickets. The workflows actually handles assignments or maybe put it into pool, handle follow-ups, work through the system, and track it all and give status updates. All of a sudden, something that used to take several months to create a ticketing system, or maybe you wanted to go through and take a look at various systems that have already been created and do updates or management or even customizations, now the workflow itself can come in and make that type of ticketing system very, very easy for either full scale on your organization or maybe even just department or team level. Makes it able to come into the place. And the other side of it is, as soon as you get your users trained on it, when those processes change, the workflow is very easy to update on that list and be able to come in and say, that was the old way we did it. It used to be that the team lead did the assignments. Now that it goes into a pool and the first person available picks it up, those kind of changes in the workflow become very easy for the site users to actually go in and manage. And that helps you as a developer keep your backlog clear for things that are more complex. Site workflows are attached to the current site itself. This may be a workflow that goes in and says, I want to request a new list, or I want to request some additional content or something like that. Maybe I want to create a new subsite. That subsite may need to go through a workflow, may need to actually tie in. I've actually used these workflows to go through and say, we're going to do a new team subsite, a new project site. Okay, The workflow itself checks and sees who's going to be the members, sets the security, pre-populates with information out of external systems through BCS. There's all of these pieces that come into play with the site workflows that you can have and actually create a lot of automation and a lot of wizardry that before you needed to work with a lot of web parts, with a lot of solutions, with a lot of features and those kind of things. So take a look at those and see how they put in. And then the reusable workflows can and must be associated with SharePoint items. I mentioned a little bit earlier they can be all over the place, but these are kind of, they're out there and then you can do that attachment. So when we go through and we put those reusable workflows, know that that'll kind of be put into place, and then you can actually attach them to various things. When you're doing a list or site workflow, you're normally attaching it directly through with SharePoint Designer. When you're working with reusable workflows, you're generally saying this one has the potential to be attached, and then then at some later time you'll actually go through and do the attachment in the SharePoint environment. Here you can actually see what we're going to be doing with the demo. You can see that we've actually got a stage 1. We've actually got some activities that can be associated with this. These are prepackaged activities. You as a developer can go through and with Visual Studio create additional activities to work with. We're going to go through some of the capabilities and some of the features with these workflows, with the different environments that those workflows are going to be in, and all of the rest. But this is just a quick little piece. You can actually see that there's a lot already in there that you can take a look at, and you'll be able to take advantage of as you work with those workflows. The workflows themselves, just like any other process, the workflows need some validation, need things to be able to put into place so that you can actually know that it's going to work the way you want to. So as you go through, you'll need to do some validation. SharePoint workflow tools generally provide WYSIWYG validation on the workflow itself. So you're actually looking at when it comes in and sees that there's a problem, it sees that you need to be looking at something different, it pops up and lets you know. The conditions for validation are generally common sense. Things like duplicate paths are not allowed. If you've got a system that's got 2 different paths between some stages that are the same condition, you're going to get flagged because, well, the system can't just pick randomly on the same condition. It's going to have to choose a single path between stages. So know that that needs to be there. Circular references aren't allowed without a loop container. SharePoint has a loop container. If you have things go through, you're used to going through a review cycle and does it get approved? If it doesn't, go back through. Know that SharePoint workflows do need to kind of have that set up. This is both for SharePoint to do some optimization and for you to actually explicitly say, yes, I know I can get in here and I may not come out. I may go through this multiple times. So you actually have that concept in your head that you need to get it back out of that loop. So it's on both sides that you need to be looking at. And all shapes and connectors must be connected. So if you're doing a workflow, you can't kind of throw a stage off into the corner and not have it connected in some way. That being said, you can't have a connector that kind of goes off and just ends in nowhere. Everything has to be tied together, and SharePoint has to know through the workflow where each step ends up at and what happens. That's not to say that your final step is the workflow ends. That is how it comes out, but it all needs to be connected in place, and you need to be able to put all of that in a way that the user knows exactly what comes in, how it works through the process, and then how it comes back out. Then once you've actually got that in place, how do you actually get that workflow into SharePoint? You need to actually make sure that you've got it's going into the right place, it's got the right permissions, all of the rest of it. Instant workflows like lists and site workflows, when you're creating them, you're already attaching them to that list or that site. You know that they're already in place. You know that they're going to be attached. So generally what happens is when you're doing that, SharePoint Designer just automatically uploads it into the correct location, puts it in place. It's pretty much a point-and-click connection. Know that you've got all those places, and it gets all the information it needs there. And with these, it's almost always directly attached with that. Remember, you're being very tactical, so it may that workflow is assuming that it may have something very specific to that list instance. That you may have something that you're keying off one of the column values, or you may be attached to a specific account on that has access to that list or that site. So all of those are kind of wrapped up into it. Reusable workflows are directly saved in the SharePoint site, can be downloaded if you want to move them around. Reusable workflows, the reason why they are reusable is they don't have that tight binding. You can say, I need to have this particular column that's going to have some information I want. Or when you attach, I'll need to know these accounts that have this particular piece. But reusable workflows are built so that you can actually connect them around, and that information gets attached, gets filled in when you put that attachment into place. So know that that's a little bit different on how those workflows are going to be put into your SharePoint implementation. And then the instance workflows can be converted to templates. So say that you've got a list workflow that somebody's gone through, you've done a great job on it, you say, this is great, and you know what? This is something new, but I'm pretty sure once the other teams see this, they'll want this as well. You can actually go through and take those instance workflows, turn them into templates using Saves template and in SharePoint Designer. It'll go into the correct repository there. You can pull those down and then move them around. So a lot of these pieces you'll actually work kind of tactically to get your prototype in place. You'll actually go there to do some testing, maybe some proofs to go through the workflow, and then you'll take that and convert it over into a template and be able to use it in other places. So note that SharePoint Designer likes to keep those workflows in SharePoint. This is for a couple of reasons. One is because you can actually do versioning. The other place is you know exactly where it is. You don't have to worry about a separate repository. You don't have to worry about file shares or it getting lost in the drive system or things like that. But you can actually come through and pull that out, save it off, let your operations guys have backups that they can put offsite or wherever they need to go. All of those processes are in place to be able to do that kind of thing.